Welcome to the Global Hydrogen interview series, where we ask what is next for what could be the new oil of the 21st century, or at very least, extremely influential in the world's evolving and low carbon energy basket. My name is 𝗤𝗂𝗡𝘀, and I'm the director of the Energy Transition Dialogues at Gulf Intelligence. And I'm very glad to say that 𝗟𝗲𝗽𝗀𝗇 is with us today. He is the Chief Executive Officer of the Delhi-based research institution, the Council on Energy, Environment and Water, also known as the CEEW. Welcome. Thank you very much for joining us again.
Hi, Michelle. Good to see you again.
Very good to see you. And I think there's a lot to talk about. We've got pledges for energy independence from India by 2047. We've got the government saying it wants to reach 12 million tons per year of hydrogen consumption by 2030, rising to 28 million tons per year by 2050. Of course, these are some initial figures, but there's a huge amount to talk about when it comes to hydrogen and India. Is it moving at the sort of pace that you think reflects the potential the market holds?
I think if you look at the early stages of the story, certainly there's a lot of momentum. Just earlier this year, the finance minister first signaled that there was a hydrogen energy mission being formulated in the country. And then a few months later, we had one of the largest conglomerates in the country coming out and saying that they were going to invest several $1 billion in developing fuel cells and electrolyzer capacity in India.
That's the $10 billion from Reliance, yes?
That's right, which the $10 billion includes investments in gigafactory or solar modules and batteries as well. But it's part of their new energy push. And then just a month ago, on the 15th of August, on our Independence Day, the Prime Minister formally announced the National Hydrogen Mission. So I think there is certainly a lot of momentum. The question is, can we make sure that the policy signals and even the business signals that have come out are backed up with action?
And how do you feel about that announcement a month ago? Do you think that there is enough meat in that strategy? I mean, many more countries are releasing strategies for hydrogen worldwide. Some are still very preliminary, some are much more advanced. I think we'll take the EU out of it completely because they're on a different league altogether. But excluding them, that everyone's at different stages. Some strategies are extremely detailed, looking at production, consumption targets, big financing packages attached to it as well. And others are more as a statement of national and purposeful intent. Where would you put India in that bracket?
You know, unlike other technological big bets, I am actually quite encouraged that India has chosen not to let this bus pass by. It has actually understood the entirety of the hydrogen supply chain, all the way from the upstream manufacturing, the transportation, storage, and the downstream use. But even more so, I see that we have already signaled that leapfrog to green hydrogen. India already uses about 5.5 million tons of hydrogen on an annual basis. So it's already a fairly large hydrogen market for a market that is, globally about 90 million tons. But the fact that we are signaling that we want to jump straight onto green hydrogen, not just from a government policy point of view, but also from what the private sector is saying, is encouraging. That said, I think we also have to be cognizant that it'll have to be sort of a staged transition towards the story, because some of the early stage plays, whether it's in long distance freight transport, or whether it is in terms of the potential to use green ammonia already, those are things that might come earlier, and things where you apply green hydrogen to displace coal in, say, steel making, perhaps comes several years down the line. Sure.
No, please.
No, one of the things I also like is that signal of the 1-1-1, that you want to bring down the cost of green hydrogen from over $4 a kilogram to less than $1 a kilogram within the current decade. So that also sends a clear signal of the kind of moonshot or earth shot that we are trying to accomplish.
And how does blue hydrogen fit in to this picture with the development of CCS? Because the green narrative, as you say, is far clearer, far stronger, bold, pushing ahead. Where do you see blue hydrogen fitting in?
I think it will fit in the sort of blending of the different hydrogen types, or the hydrogen rainbow, as we could call it. If you take steel, for instance, today India is the second largest manufacturer of steel in the world after China. Now, if we were to move towards green steel, we could either wait for the green hydrogen cost to completely come down over, say, the next 1.5 decades or so. But what our analysis suggests is that if you even blended 9% of green hydrogen with natural gas in the steel making, then you are able to introduce green hydrogen at an early stage of the cost trajectory, while also beginning to blend in the blue hydrogen or natural gas derived hydrogen. So I think it's important not to do this in an either or way, and yet send a signal that the green hydrogen direction is where we really want to go.
Do you think there's understanding of that potential, of the blending potential on the ground, or do you think that there is still more of an either or mentality when it comes to hydrogen? Obviously, hydrogen itself isn't a very new market, actually discovered in 1766. So in that sense, it's certainly not new, but it's been used in industrial purposes for decades. It's more the green, obviously, that's emerging due to the plunging renewable costs. And obviously, the net zero targets and decarbonisation agendas that are emerging. Do you feel like, because the speed of change has relatively been very fast, that some companies might have an either or attitude still? Is there an education factor?
Yes, I think the issue of the either or is not so much between the blue and the green hydrogen. It's more between the current fuels and hydrogen.
Yeah. So
that's where there might be some resistance amongst industries that haven't totally internalized the opportunity. And that's why I said, if you look at passenger transport, it's unlikely that hydrogen will play a big role. I think the battery electric vehicle story will be what will unfold. But if you look at the long distance freight transport, where the certainty of your charging infrastructure is not there and so forth, then you can start thinking about the fuel cell driven trucks. Now, that sort of demand pull from the long distance freight transport sector then begins to create or mobilize the hydrogen ecosystem. The other thing that perhaps adds to some of the resistance is the transportation. I mean, as you said, the technology has been known for a while, but how do you store and transport hydrogen? It is problematic. And in fact, renewables derived hydrogen here actually perhaps has a little bit more of an advantage, because it's cheaper to transmit the electrons across long distances from a place where you're generating solar power to a place where you've got an electrolyzer on at the other end of the country, than to manufacture hydrogen and transport it. Of course, that will require some regulatory changes, lowering what are called the wheeling charges, etc. But it also creates that potential for a more distributed production base for the green hydrogen in different parts of the country. One more element, if I may, that can look at the blue and green hydrogen sort of transition is the pipeline infrastructure. Right? Today, we have about 20,000 kilometers of natural gas pipelines, and another 15,000 kilometers are being built. Now,
so there's a huge head start in this.
A huge head start, but of course, you can't transport hydrogen at the pressure it is in through the existing natural gas pipelines. So what you need to do is look at the retrofit or look at the upcoming pipelines. Can you use reinforced pipelines that are able to transport hydrogen at the pressures that they are? Now that allows for a natural gas infrastructure today to not become stranded.
I mean, this is very similar, isn't it, to what the EU is doing with their 40,000 kilometers worth of hydrogen-ready pipelines that they're targeting by 2040, I believe, and to avoid this stranded assets risk that is estimated over $1 trillion
Yes.
in the next couple of decades from the fossil fuel industry. I'm glad you touched on that side of things as well, because I'd be really keen to hear more about how you see the oil and gas sector evolving within this hydrogen growth. What kind of role do you see them being able to take primarily? What's their future?
See, on the gas side, most of our gas is imported, and that is the difference between, India and the EU, where while EU is also importing a lot of gas, the landed price of gas in the EU is completely different from the landed price of gas in India. And if that were to be the transition fuel, we as part of our energy strategy, India has said that building a gas-based economy is one critical component, in addition to building out the 450 gigawatts of renewables and the hydrogen play. So the landed price of natural gas will matter a lot in terms of how the oil and gas companies respond to the opportunity. The other element is the off-taker. Today, the off-taker of the natural gas is primarily the fertilizer industry. So what is happening in India is there's a lot of conversation already beginning about purchase obligations for green ammonia. So if then, instead of having sort of just the traditional natural gas-based urea being produced, if the same companies that know the fertilizer industry, know the supply chain, but can begin to see a pathway from looking at natural gas-based fertilizer to green hydrogen-based fertilizer, blended fertilizer, then I think the risk of stranded assets becomes a little bit more mitigated, at least for a transition.
So not completely overhauling, but essentially tweaking those supply chains and tweaking those strategies. What about India and the UAE and their conversations when it comes to hydrogen? Obviously, there's a very strong relationship there with the Middle East as a whole, with energy exports over to India and keen to sustain that trade relationship. When it comes to hydrogen, how can the oil, the fossil fuel market in the Middle East and that within India, how can they develop together?
So two things. One, of course, there is already conversation happening between India and some Middle Eastern countries, Oman, UAE, and I believe even Saudi Arabia, about this opportunity in hydrogen. In one case, one Indian renewable energy company is already building out a facility in Oman to do it and invest in this area. But I would go a step further. As you know, India has a very, very large petrochemicals industry as well. And much of the crude is, of course, coming from Middle East, or what in India we call West Asia, because it's west of us rather than middle of the East. So how do we then look at this purchase of crude that is then getting converted into petrochemicals from the largest refinery in the world to something that begins to serve as, again, a transition that we could collaborate on natural gas derived hydrogen or blended hydrogen, and then also benefit from the very large renewable energy potential that exists in the Middle East as well. So you keep bringing down the costs of deriving the renewables, but you're leveraging the existing infrastructure of then moving from, say, natural gas derived methanol to green methanol or hydrogen derived methanol. So these are some of the areas in which I think there can be certainly some commercial interest already.
So obviously a lot of NOCs in the Middle East and globally have much increased emphasis on renewables. They've got renewable arms now, renewable projects that they're developing, and R&D that they're supporting, and so on. So you very much see on that side, so some of those traditional relationships between those in the Middle East and India when it comes to fossil fuels, those evolving with India engaging with those NOCs as part of their renewables arm for green hydrogen, and then as part of the existing market for blue hydrogen and even grey. Is that how you see it?
that is how I see it. If you look at the demand for, oil and gas, for us, it's primarily the transportation sector, and gas, as I said, was for fertilizer. Now, as the passenger transportation sector kind of begins to peter out, say in a decade and a half, and moves in a big way towards electric transportation, you will need a different demand source to demand center to emerge. And that's where I think that the relationship between India and West Asia can continue based on these existing commercial linkages that are there. One more thing that will matter, of course, is the indigenization of the electrolyzers. And India, of course, has a very strong interest in this. From our calculations, again, we think that India has perhaps the lowest cost electrolyzer manufacturing base. Now,
in the world.
Well, when you compare some major economies across the world. Now, how could India leverage that? And again, could some of the companies, the NOCs that have an interest, again, maybe of exporting green hydrogen from the Middle East, but invest in a manufacturing base in India, tap into the advanced technical talent we have at lower costs, the material costs, etc., and then use those electrolyzers for their own exports. I think what is needed, Michelle, is and I've proposed this recently, is I call it a global green hydrogen alliance, but global does not mean 200 countries. It means a critical mass of key countries in the Middle East, India, rest of Asia, which will have major demand for hydrogen, Australia, Northeast Asia, and then even parts of Europe. And then you see who has a better chance of making electrolyzers at low cost, who has great renewable energy resources to manufacture, who has a petrochemical industry or the feedstock to go into the move towards blue hydrogen and then the blend with green hydrogen, who has the technology for transportation, so the whole bunker fuels opportunity in terms of green ammonia replacing for bunker fuels in the shipping industry. So you create a more interdependent supply chain.
You create an ecosystem, you create a market, essentially.
Exactly. And you also standardize the protocols for safety, for transportation. So you reduce the transaction costs, reduce potential trade barriers, and make sure, as you said right at the outset, perhaps the oil of the 21st century, you make sure that it's the supply chain of it is, pun intended, lubricated enough to move at a faster pace.
And also, this is no different to, well, obviously it's on a far greater, more integrated scale, but it's only in the last 10 years we've seen NOCs in the Middle East establishing very large, very expensive refining operations in Asia and other countries, sending their produce there for, developing their global refining footprint as one example. And there's no reason, as you mentioned at the beginning of what you just commented on, that the similar sort of relationship couldn't be based with India when it came to hydrogen, and making the most of those manufacturing capabilities in India, and that relationship evolving in that way.
Indeed, and if you see it more as an investment opportunity, Michelle, right? At least in India, every 1 million tons per annum of hydrogen demand, green hydrogen demand, is a $40 billion investment opportunity. As I said earlier, we have a current market of 5.5 million tons per annum. So that's a $200 billion opportunity.
It's an attractive industry.
Market, right? So I think as oil and gas companies think about the transition, rather than thinking of a complete fall off the cliff, if they see that a lot of the technology and the infrastructure that they're familiar with can then be applied to an emerging energy source, and then see it as an investment opportunity in a high-tech, low-cost country like India, I think we can see the elements of that supply chain building out, and also the transition pathway for some of these NOCs.
When do you think we might be able to start seeing this progress? Like you say, talks are already going on. National hydrogen strategies in India have been released and are being firmed up all the time. Haven't quite got that same sort of structure from some of the Middle Eastern countries spoken about yet, but there is extremely clear intent from the upper echelons of government and leadership that they do want to. So what kind of timeline are we looking at with this level of progress, where we see shipments between the two nations, where we see R&D agreements being signed? What sort of timeline do you expect?
I think it will require, Michelle, a demand pull and a supply push. And if you look at the National Hydrogen Mission that's been announced in India, as I was mentioning, there's already talk that's happening about establishing, on one hand, a performance-linked incentive scheme for manufacture of the electrolyzers. There's also talk about a purchase obligation for green ammonia. Once we create that policy-based demand pull, I think you don't have to wait 5 years, 10 years. You can actually start thinking about getting into those relationships within the next 24 months. And then demonstrating that you can do this at scale. See, what India is offering, and especially for countries with whom it has long-term trading relationships in energy, is the market size, right? And that demand pull. Now, how can the companies in the Middle East or elsewhere immediately follow through on that market opportunity as soon as those demand obligations are put out through policy? And that could be just in a matter of months. So I honestly think that we can have green ammonia plants coming up in the Middle East and in India within the next 24 months. I think we can have a pilot project on green steel within the next 5 years. And I think if we can strike some of these at least memoranda of understanding between these countries. I mean, by my count, and you left out the EU. So even leaving out the EU, about 32 countries around the world have announced something or the other on hydrogen. 24 have announced something specifically on green hydrogen. But right now, it's all sort of, sparks here and there that you hear this news.
Exactly.
We need that aggregation of that demand and the supply to demonstrate that, okay, by 2024, we want this. By 2027, we want this pilot up and running. By 2030, we are aiming for this cost for hydrogen production or this cost for electrolyzer production, with an outlook that our businesses will be interdependent in a new energy ecosystem of the 21st century.
I mean, as you just mentioned, the S word there, you just mentioned about scale, and India is all about the scale. It's expected to become the world's 4th largest economy by 2030, the 3rd largest by 2050. It's currently got the world's biggest population, anticipated to have the 2nd biggest population, anticipated to have the world's greatest population by 2024. There's huge scope to improve socioeconomic value, and within that, the government's push and appetite to improve that side of things as well. So all the indicators, as you said, are certainly pushing in the direction that India is certainly one to watch. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, which is a shame because there's so much to say. So I'd like to thank you very much for joining us again. I really hope you'll join us later this year as well, because it'll be fascinating to see what happens at COP and your perspective on how India plays a role within that, and perhaps we'll have more clarity as well when it comes to formalized hydrogen plans and more detail on the roadmap. So thank you very, very much, and I hope to see you again soon.
Thank you, Michelle. It was a great conversation. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. Thank you.